Is a new Iran nuclear agreement on the brink of being a done deal? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. There is growing speculation that negotiations aimed at restarting the Iran nuclear deal that was finalized in 2015 could be close to success. For months now, on and off talks have taken place in Vienna, aimed at reviving the major international agreement. But the conflict in Ukraine and other concerns, mainly between Iran and the United States, have prevented a major breakthrough. However, on Wednesday, Iran's foreign minister said during a visit to Syria that a deal could be close, saying, quote, "If the U.S. acts pragmatically, we are ready to have foreign ministers of countries belonging to the Nuclear Deals Joint Commission gather in Vienna to finalize the agreement. We believe that today we are closer to an agreement in Vienna than ever before." Meanwhile, the United States, who pulled out of the original agreement during the Trump administration, is now putting the onus on Tehran and is publicly less optimistic.
An agreement of this sort is neither imminent nor is it certain. And so that is precisely why, for the better part of a year, we have been preparing for either contingency, for either scenario.
We have a great panel assembled to discuss the many angles to this international story. Joining us now from Florida is Mohsen Milani. He is a professor of politics at the University of South Florida. He's an expert on Iranian foreign policy. With us here in Washington is Barbara Slavin. She is director of the Future of the Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Joining us from Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer. He is a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. And from Beijing, Andy Mock. Also joining the discussion, he's a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you all for joining us. Barbara, why don't I start with you? I mean, the Iran foreign minister seems optimistic. Ned Price seems a lot more circumspect. We're getting kind of two different messages here. You've been following this for a long time, and you're able to read the tea leaves. What are we hearing? What are we seeing?
Well, I have to tell you, I was optimistic for a while. Then we had, of course, the complication where the Russians suddenly seemed to demand more trade concessions from the deal beyond the specific role that they are assigned in the nuclear agreement. Now, the sticking point seems to be over a designation of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. Iran is demanding that this designation be lifted, and the United States in return is asking Iran to make a pledge that it will de-escalate tensions in the Middle East. This is a bit of a shadow play. I mean, the designation, frankly, doesn't have much practical meaning. Iran's IRGC is already sanctioned under other authorities that make it basically impossible for Western companies to have anything to do with entities that are controlled by the IRGC. But this has become the subject of a big political fight in Washington with, I must say, people who never supported the original agreement now using this as a stick to beat the administration with. So I'm not sure where this comes out. The talks are at a pause. Iran is celebrating the New Year, Iranian New Year, Nowruz, so they're on a break at least for this week, possibly next week. I'm waiting to see if the American negotiators go back to Vienna. I think that would be a sign that we really are close to a final deal.
And Mohsen, what about these sticking points that Barbara brings up? Do you see them as a roadblock or something kind of incremental that can be worked out pretty quickly?
Thank you very much for inviting me to your program. I share Barbara's view that hopefully we're going to have a nuclear deal. I'm a little bit more optimistic than she is. I think in the past few weeks we have seen a number of hiccups, such as the Russian demand that the U.S. gives written guarantee that the sanctions are not going to be used against Russia in its dealing with Iran. And now the question of the Revolutionary Guard designation as a foreign terrorist organization. I think these are not major issues. I am optimistic because I believe having a nuclear deal serves American national interest, serves Iranian national interest, and both countries are now reaching a point where they're trying to get additional concessions from each other. But eventually, both countries will come to their senses, and hopefully they're going to sign a nuclear deal that is win-win for the United States, for Iran, for the international community, and for the region itself.
Mohsen, just walk us through where we've come, because, you know, we had the deal, Trump backed out, there was a maximum pressure campaign, Biden's elected, things look like they may be worked out, but then back in September, we had the Iran foreign minister say, quote, we do not have the time to sit in meetings simply to drink coffee with one another. There was nothing tangible. Where do you see the breakthrough in this? And kind of walk us through this whole process, because at one point, there were no direct talks between Iran and the U.S. Still a lot of resentment there.
We still don't have direct talks between Iran and the United States. Iran deals with the U.S. through the European intermediaries, and I think it's a mistake. I have called for Iran to directly engage in negotiations with the United States. But going back to your question, the fundamental issue is this, that President Donald Trump decided to get out of the Iranian nuclear deal and impose draconian sanctions on Iran, believing that through a maximum pressure strategy, he can make Iran cry uncle. He can make Iran get back to the negotiating table and sign a better and more enduring nuclear deal. It did not work out. Because it didn't work out, and none of the things that Mr. Trump or Secretary of State Pompeo believe, that Iran is going to disintegrate, that the economic pressure is going to make the people of Iran take to the streets, and then there could be a regime change, or that Iran is going to be forced to come to the negotiating table. Not only none of the things happened, as a matter of fact, Iran made huge advances in its nuclear program. Before 2015, Iran was able to enrich uranium at 20%. Today, Iran is able to enrich uranium at 60%. Iran is much closer to becoming a virtual nuclear power than it was before. Therefore, I think the American administration, the current administration, has made a wise decision that it is in American national interest to stop the clock of Iran making advances toward nuclear energy, nuclear bomb. And Iran also has made the decision that it is in its interest to have the U.S. And the international community lift the sanctions against the Islamic Republic and against innocent Iranians, by the way.
Pavel, there are those who feel that Russia could really play the role of a spoiler here, especially with the kind of the international environment we're seeing right now with the situation in Ukraine, that they could possibly torpedo this deal. I want to get the sense of how this is being viewed in Moscow.
Not really, of course, in the, it's a bit under the radar screen, I would say, because, of course, the acute confrontation with the West, the sanctions, the not very successful war in Ukraine that's dragging on. There's a problem. There's maybe even not just simply draconian sanctions, but a blockade of Russia from the West. So Russia is right now preoccupied, of course, with that. An Iranian deal, if it happens, on one side, it's not maybe good that it will release Iranian oil to the world market, and that would make it easier for the West to sanction Russia more and begin to embargo the export of Russian oil. On the other side of it, if Iran sees Russia making some monkey business and throwing wrenches into the works against Iranian interest, that could also be not good for Russia, because right now Russia doesn't have many friends, and it has Iran to the south, and if they become rather unfriendly or annoyed, that's also not in Russia's interest in the present situation. So I don't believe that Russia is going to spoil a deal if a deal is ready. Russia demanded some additional guarantees that its dealings with Iran will not be under American sanctions, and that would be most likely good enough. I don't think that the Kremlin thinks about the Iranian deal all the time right now. They have other things to do.
Andy, speaking of which, Russia does have other things that they're obviously preoccupied with. Do you think Ukraine and what's happening there, does that change the calculus in any of this, do you think?
I absolutely think it does, Mike. And, we need to first understand what's going on in Ukraine. This really has been instigated by the United States, and it's created a global crisis because both energy and food are global commodities with global markets, and we're seeing skyrocketing prices. And this is not only backfiring on the U.S. domestically, where I believe in California, gas prices are now above $6 a gallon, and even some places $7 a gallon. And we know how politically dangerous that can be domestically. But this is also backfiring on the U.S. globally as well, because of course oil is a very important energy commodity, but natural gas is as well. And Europe is dependent on Russian natural gas to the tune of 5.5, not billion, but trillion cubic feet per year. Now, what does this mean for the Iran deal? I think that the U.S. is trying to walk a tightrope here that really is untenable, and it is trapped and twisting on the horns of a dilemma in Europe and in Iran as well. And I think this is forcing the U.S. to seek any kind of deal in desperation. But the final point here is the U.S. Through decades of antagonism has a number of adversaries around the world, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and in some sense maybe the chickens are coming home to roost here. So I think this will be a dangerous time for the U.S., but also a very bad time for billions of people around the world who are suffering high energy, high food prices, and again that really has been instigated by the United States.
Barbara, I want to get your take on what Andy just said.
I disagree so completely, I don't even know where to begin. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia is bombarding innocent civilians in Ukraine. This is who caused the crisis. The United States and Western allies have responded to this outrageous violation of international law. And I'm entirely befuddled by the comments coming from your guest in China. Yes, it is causing problems in terms of supplies of food and so on, but all Vladimir Putin has to do is stop bombing the country next to him, stop bombing all of these innocent people, many of whom are Russian speakers, by the way, and have relatives in Russia, and the Ukrainians will be able to plant their wheat, and Russia's economy will be able to return to normal. This is outrageous. I'm sorry. I don't know where it comes from.
Mike, may I respond to that?
Sure, go ahead, Andy.
So I'd like to ask Barbara, if that's so true, how do you explain NATO expansion? Why has the U.S. and NATO been training Ukraine forces for a number of years? Why have people from
Sure. May I?
Even George Kennan.
People of the former Soviet.
May I finish, please? May I finish, please? And then you can respond.
Yes, go ahead, Andy.
Why have people from George Kennan to John Mearsheimer to Henry Kissinger all said that the NATO expansion and the stance towards Ukraine is really the proximate cause of this?
I can't speak for others. I believe George Kennan is dead. But what I can say is that the countries that formerly were part of the Soviet Union, were part of the Soviet bloc, many of them sought admission to NATO, sought admission to the European Union. This was the sovereign choice of these countries. Ukraine has wanted to join NATO. NATO has not accepted Ukraine. I'm sorry if you don't like the views of the people in these countries, but that was their decision. And the Ukrainians have 3 times rejected Russian efforts to control their destiny in 2004, in 2014, and now they are fighting for their very existence with bravery that is beyond what many had expected. The fact that they've gotten training and support from the West is because they asked for it. And we see now that they really needed this support and help from the West because of the insane decision by Vladimir Putin to attack them in this brutal way.
All right. I don't want to get off the rails on Ukraine too much. I want to kind of focus this back on the JCPOA. So, Andy, China, of course, is signatory on this deal. They've been very much speaking about their support for the revival of the deal. In fact, Wang Yi signed a landmark 25-year cooperation pact with Iran recently. Give us the perspective in Beijing.
Sure. Well, Mike, I think the Chinese official position for years, if not decades, rhetorically has been China is on the side of peaceful development everywhere at all times. And I think it certainly has walked the walk and not only talked the talk. We've seen, of course, China's decades of domestic economic development and social development, but also how it's conducted itself on the global stage. Look at BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, other roles that it's been playing, both in established international organizations like the UN, as well as supplementing these organizations with new ones like AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, its role in RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So I think it's clear that China's stance and its very clear views is towards peaceful development. And I think with Iran as well, that we see the U.S. role in fomenting not just political problems, intervening, violating the sovereignty of other countries, but look at the awful human cost of the lives lost, people maimed, including women and children in Afghanistan, in Iraq, other parts of the world. So I think there's really a dramatic contrast between China's philosophy and its deeds compared to the really unfortunate track record of the U.S.
Mohsen, talk to us about the U.S. and the position in the negotiations. You mentioned that there were no face-to-face negotiations, but it's interesting, when Trump did pull out of the agreement, other signatories weighed in. At the time, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said it was regrettable. Boris Johnson urged the U.S. not to hinder others who were involved so that the agreement could still stay in place. Then you have Biden elected. You know, the other signatories didn't want the U.S. to leave this agreement. As you said, no face-to-face negotiations. So talk to us about their role in the negotiations. Did it make it difficult for the Biden administration to actually bring any kind of oomph to the negotiations?
The calculation in Tehran when President Trump was inaugurated was that the U.S. is not going to be able, from a legal point of view, to get out of a nuclear deal that was endorsed unanimously by the United Nations Security Council. But they were wrong. And when President Trump got out of the nuclear deal and imposed really severe sanctions on Iran, with all due respect to the Europeans, all I heard from them is to complain that the U.S. should not. But they did not. They did not follow their obligations. They essentially sided with the United States and continued to impose sanctions on Iran. The only two countries that were on the side of Iran were Russia and China. Of course, they were under a lot of pressure to follow American sanctions too, but they were much more helpful to Iran than the European powers were. But now the Europeans, who always knew that this deal, this nuclear deal, is good for Europe, is good for the United States, now they're trying to convince the United States to come back and sign the deal. One of the sticking points, and I have no idea how this nuclear deal, the new one, is going to address it. To me, this is the key element. Whether the IRGC is going to be designated as a terrorist or not, these are symbolic acts. It doesn't mean much. The IRGC is already sanctioned to the teeth. The key is are there going to be any kind of guarantees, any kind of mechanism that make it impossible for the next American administration in 2.5 years to get out of the nuclear deal if they want to get out of the nuclear deal? To me, that is the key issue. And the reason why the United States, Iran does not want to talk to the United States is A, because they believe the US got out, and therefore it has no business being a part of these negotiations. But I think there is a second reason, and that is the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani. He was a close confidant. He was near and dear to Ayatollah Khamenei, and Ayatollah Khamenei feels awful about what happened. And therefore, they're trying not to directly negotiate with the United States because they want to have a nuclear deal, but they do not want to start negotiations about Iranian nuclear missiles and about Iranian regional activities. Once they have a nuclear deal without direct negotiations with the United States, I think Iran is going to have a better leverage to one day come to the negotiation with the West about its missile program and it's about its activities in the Middle East.
Barbara, let's talk a little bit more about what he just said, because there is this whipsaw nature of foreign policy in the United States. Obama, you got a deal. Trump, the deal's gone away. Biden, it looks like the deal's back. What happens with the new administration? And that has to enter into the conversation if you're in Tehran.
It does indeed, and I think I understand why many in Iran are reluctant to come back into this agreement, because frankly, under our political system, there are no guarantees that this agreement will continue. The sanctions relief comes through executive orders through the White House, and so a different president can make a different decision. I think the argument that others are making is that, especially with oil at sky-high prices, even if an agreement only lasts for a couple of years, Iran will be able to make so much money through oil sales. Also, it will be able to repatriate billions of dollars of oil revenues that are frozen in foreign bank accounts, that even if the agreement only lasts another 2 years or so, it still will be in Iran's benefit. But I do understand the reluctance of people in Tehran. It's a facet of our system. We change governments. We don't have dictators who stay in power for 22 years like Vladimir Putin and others seeking long terms like the leader of China without end. And so there are changes. There are changes at the top. There are changes in Secretary of State and the people who implement agreements. But Biden is an opportunity for Iran, and I think it's an opportunity that Iran should take. Also, we've seen what happens when the U.S. quits the deal, and nothing good happens. Sanctions are imposed, but they hurt ordinary people far more than the regime. The regime advances on the nuclear front and continues all of the activities in the region, missile development, and so on, that the United States and others object to. So hopefully, the next administration will keep to an agreement if it can be revived. And
Pavel, you mentioned it earlier, Barbara just touching on it too. If this deal is agreed to, suddenly Iran oil floods the market, and you mentioned this could really kind of have a devastating impact on Russia if you have some of these countries deciding they're going to shun Russian oil to go with crude somewhere else because of what's going on in Ukraine. How much of a concern is that?
Well, it is a bit of a concern. Of course, it's not that Iran can replace Russia. Russia is a really major oil producer and a major oil exporter, and it's not that. Well, I mean, it's Iran and oil could come to Europe to replace Russia, and Russia could go, I know, to India to replace Iranian, but that would mean additional costs and logistical problems, and right now it's also, well, a very serious situation in Russia logistically, and the situation is very serious politically and militarily. I mean, in Europe we're almost somewhere close to a possible escalation into an all-European war that may go nuclear. I mean, in such a situation, Iran really goes to the back burner for everyone, for the Europeans, for the Americans, not, of course, for the Iranians. So they have an opportunity right now. And those who oppose them in the Middle East will have to look out because, well, the big powers right now are clinched in a confrontation in another place. Russia, of course, needs Iran. It needs a friendly Iran. Russia still maintains strategically important bases in Syria, and Iran controls a lot what's happening there on the ground, if Russia controls more that's happening in the air. So Russia will not do anything that will really harm relations between Russia and Iran at this point of history. That means Russia is not going to hinder the deal. Russia will say it's a good idea.
Yeah.
The Russian negotiators are working there in Vienna. The Kremlin simply doesn't really right now think much about it. They have other problems that they're working on.
Yeah. Andy, it's interesting, Mohsen pointed out that China really threw an economic lifeline to Iran. And there's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations who wrote this back in January. China's economic support has incentivized Iran to remain in the deal, and China has made it clear that a deepening of bilateral ties really hinges on a deal coming back into play. If the nuclear deal is saved, China's economic diplomacy will deserve considerable credit. Do you see that as a fair reading of China's role in all of this?
I do, Mike. And again, I think one thing that I think Barbara made an excellent point, that certain types of government structures promote stability and consistency, whether that's in Russia or whether that's in China. And from a purely pragmatic perspective, for the lives of a country's own citizens, as well as the global community, this kind of continuity and predictability is much, much better than being whipsawed every 4 years. And I think here, though, I want to make a quick point about how much impact a deal could have on the oil market. So OPEC and OPEC Plus historically have been pretty disciplined about oil supply. They have production targets. So I don't know that this could change a lot. The second point I think is very important to point out, too, is that for the U.S., what it has done in sanctions towards Russia may actually be worse than the problem it's trying to solve, because by weaponizing the financial system and large parts of the global commodities markets, I think what the U.S. is unleashing, they've shown that really it cannot be relied upon and is acting like a rogue state, and this is going to only accelerate demands for alternatives.
Andy, I'm sorry we've run completely out of time, but I want to thank our panelists. It's been a great discussion. We are out of time. Thanks so much for joining us on another edition of The Heat.